Long ago, before the flood was even an idea in anyone's head, before humanity would struggle against the onslaught of alien species hell-bent on our destruction, and before humans were actually even set back genetically to a more inferior version of ourselves, existed a time when mortal enemies were allied with one another. Over 100,000 years in the past, existed an alliance between Homo Sapiens and the ancient shyuum. Because of the technological prowess of the shyuum, they would be sought out by humans in order to access their tech that was even deemed impressive by Forerunner measures. However, this was not meant to last. With the Forerunners having turned against the precursors, their own creators, the precursors would grind themselves down into a fine powder in order to survive the Forerunner incursion. Over time, however, this powder would be discovered and then go on to become the Flood. With humanity having discovered this horror first, they would attempt to combat this new parasite with failing capacities to control it, but eventually they just really turned to destroying worlds in order to contain it. To the Forerunners, this appeared to be an attack, as essentially it was. Ultimately, because of these actions, the Forerunners would be forced to raise arms against humanity and its allies, the shyuum. Over a relatively lengthy war, known as the Human Forerunner War, it would be discovered too late that humanity wasn't attacking the Forerunners for funsies, but instead was trying to contain something that could wipe out all of the galaxy's life. The Forerunners were aggressive in their punishment for the war, however. Reducing humanity down on a genetic level to what amounted to a caveman, the shyuum would also be punished to a degree, but much less so than humanity. They were allowed to exist within a quarantine zone and have a few of their planets to trade between. The once spacefaring species would be severely hindered and kneecapped to the point that it was actually just a shell of what they once were. So in today's episode, considering we have seen what appears to be a shyuum in Halo Infinite, I figured it was time to make a return to Halo lore to discuss the lore and morphology of the shyuum and why they have ended up the way they are, and potentially also explain what this version is that we have seen in the next installment of the Halo series. But I believe the first place we should start is where it all began, the cradle of life of the shyuum people, because it only gets worse from here for this species. Hailing from a planet not unlike our planet that bore the Homo Sapiens race, Janjur Quam, and I'm pretty sure I just brutalized that name, is considered to be a jungle planet orbiting within the habitable zone of its parent star. This planet being within the Goldilocks zones means that liquid water could exist on the surface, which has the capability to create the soup of life. So if you would like to know why water is so important to life, it acts as a median for materials. Hydrogen bonds are strong enough to keep materials close enough, but also form new compounds that would be considered organic in nature and still remain liquid at relatively low atmospheric pressure and lower and higher temperatures than a lot of other liquids. Anyhow, this planet has roughly about the same gravitational strength as Earth does at 0.95 Gs and a comparable atmosphere that is able to support the breathing concerning the Sangheli, which considering humans can breathe on Sanghelios means it can support humans as well. This would indicate that the shyuum are in fact an oxygen-based species, much like us. The length of the day is also similar to Earth being at 30 hours and 1 year being 290 Earth days. So in most respects, it spins a little slower but travels around its star a little faster. All this said, however, does not mean it's a perfect planet. Much like the adversity humanity would have to contend with on our journey to Big Brain Hours, the shyuum also had to contend with native fauna of their homeworld, where they were regularly eaten by large amphibious creatures as they continue to evolve to higher beings. The landscape itself could also be fairly unforgiving. Having large oceans and seas break up the landscape, areas were lined with geological events creating massive mountain chains of arid areas. This could effectively cut off different portions of the population and may have played a role in limiting their population size due to livable areas and supply chain issues as they continue to advance their society. And isn't supply chain issues just a popular topic these days? But it appears though, as far as reproduction is concerned, this did limit them as they did not get as frisky as humanity would, and really the females would go long periods without actually having any young, and they would release a hormone that would then basically cause the males to want to get frisky. But the key is that there was a long time in between actual spawning events. Eventually, however, they were able to achieve what no other species on the planet had done, an actual technological scale. For millions of years, they refined their technology before ultimately meeting a strange, mostly hairless creature that also stood upright, known as a human. However, this story isn't about humans, but something to note is, while young, the shyuum are actually close enough in human features that both species are capable of finding the other attractive. So you definitely know there was some best girl tally action going on in the Halo universe, much like in the Mass Effect one. I digress. For a time, as they ascended up the technological scale, everything was good, right up until they ended up getting into a war with the Forerunners brought on by humanity. The issue was, while the shyuum were highly intelligent and had impressive technology, they were by no means actually warriors. They could absolutely fight, but the reality is they were more of like hedonistic scientists than soldiers. But as the Alliance demanded, they were required to engage in battle to aid humanity before ultimately losing and being subjected to the aforementioned punishment. Now, this is not to say that the shyuum did not have basically a form of special forces. They were accomplished warriors, because I know somebody's gonna be in the comments be like, actually Roanoke. So yeah, I just throwing that out there right now. Still, again, this punishment was a much better version than what humanity was handed. However, during this time, it is suggested that they also were genetically manipulated, which will come into play later. After the receding event following the fire firing of the halo arrays, 500 million shyuum were brought back to Jandraquam and left to their own devices on the planet. With their memories of what they once were wiped out and no knowledge of humanity or even the Forerunners, they would come across Forerunner technology and began to revere this tech as a gift from their gods. This would inspire different thinking amongst the shyuum, much to the detriment of their own success. A division began to form between the two sides of the species, which presented a whole other bunch of issues later for the shyuum. Some wanted to learn and dissect the Forerunner technology for their own benefit. This would advance them quickly up the tech scale and make them a formidable spacefaring force once more. These were known as the Reformists. The other side was much larger and were known as the Stoics. They believed that these artifacts were holy in nature and should not be touched. As such, it was heresy to even talk about trying to understand them. This was specifically, though, referring to the dreadnought crashed into the planet when Mendicant Bias used it to attempt to aid humanity. It should be noted that the other artifacts are in fact studied and used to aid the shyuum. Moving on, eventually this led to a war between the two sides. The Reformists stormed the ship and locked themselves away in it to understand it, while the Stoics attempted to stop them. Despite their best efforts, they were not successful in stopping the Reformists, and eventually they were able to get the ship running. Upon their departure, a massive chunk of the planet was taken away, which would go on to be filled by the surrounding water known as the Great Apotheia. It's actually the giant circular crater in the middle of the northern hemisphere of their home planet. Upon leaving, they realized that they effed up Aaron, and there was really not enough of them to promote enough genetic diversity, and if they weren't careful, this would lead to some inbreeding issues. Strict rules were formed in order to combat this, but it can only do so much to stave it off. They resigned to live on the ship with the rock attached, and this is actually why there's that giant rock attached to High Charity. As the Reformists traveled, they began to find more and more artifacts, and this would ultimately lead them into confrontation. Upon finding the Sangheili, the race is basically handing them their tails consistently, and it became apparent that the elites were a force to be reckoned with. Instead of engaging in endless battles, they decided to team up as the Sangheili became the protectors of the shyuum. Over the course of the next 1,000 years, the Covenant would form by adding in more and more alien life until they ran across an old friend, humanity. Now, clearly their memory had been wiped, meaning that they had no original knowledge of humanity left in their species. However, considering the fact that they had Forerunner tech at their disposal, it can't be ignored that the Forerunners likely mentioned humanity and the ancient shyuum in some ancient texts. Now, this wouldn't be great because obviously the Forerunners would be very angry at humanity, and then concerning the shyuum's opinion of the Forerunners, them being basically gods, they probably hated humanity. I mean, it feels a little targeted, doesn't it? You ever notice how, like, even when the Sangheili had some respect for humanity, as it's mentioned they were impressed that humans would sacrifice themselves so that others could escape, which is deemed honorable. And considering the elites are all about honor, they would approach the shyuum asking why the humans could not join the Covenant. Well, this is likely because the shyuum learned about possibly why they were punished and for what reason. Their old pal humanity spilling the spaghetti out of their pocket. They would also learn humanity was the inheritor of the mantle, and this threatened the Great Journey. So this led to a ton of bloodshed, with humanity being pushed to the brink of extinction, with Earth having been found, which, as you guessed, probably wasn't good, but it would ultimately work out. The shyuum were also experiencing their own issues at this point. Their original home planet Star would ultimately collapse during the existence of the Covenant, which would be prior to meeting humanity, just so we know. They were able to acquire some females, but with the star having gone supernova, it wiped out most of their species, meaning there was really nobody to go back to and breed with, and this was going to be a massive issue later on. As they engaged with humanity concerning the logistical side, and definitely not the fighting side as they let others deal with that, they would ultimately find out that humans know what the ladies like, and they just didn't have it in them to overcome their former allies. They would truly go on to regret being alien bastards, as their raggedy-ass fleet was in fact blown up by the core. This created a bit of an issue, however. The shyuum were running the species under them quite thin. Turns out you can't just lie to everyone and then send them into a meat grinder, as even aliens would tend to question that. Pockets of supposed heresy began popping up, Atriox being one of them, having had a group of special force elites sent after him, who then he would go on to create the Banished, and if you'd like to see a video on that, let me know. But also the elites themselves began to have their doubts. The shyuum predicted this may happen and began arming the brutes as their new protectors, began sharing all their technology with them. This would create a schism within the Covenant, as the elites were fairly obviously upset by this. The brutes would ultimately turn on the elites under the manipulation of the shyuum. For this betrayal, the elites would start to seek retribution by annihilating every shyuum they came across. Because of this schism, the elites would turn to humanity and say, hey, my bad about the billions of lives, you want to stomp some worm faces? To which humanity pretty much answers like, yeah, but you still suck. Then they would join forces combating the remnants of the Covenant. The Covenant would ultimately fall apart shortly after this, with the shyuum realizing that the jig is up, the news is out, the aliens have finally found them. They would flee to an unknown part of the galaxy and hide, knowing that if the Sangheili found them, they would be wiped out, and likely this species would go extinct, as there were only a few thousand of them left at this point. Cortana would ultimately put out a call for them to join her, meaning that she knows they are alive, but nobody knows where they went. So there are several things within the lore that show a direct path into what we see concerning the shyuum. Starting with the most basic body metrics, your average shyuum is about 7 feet to 7.5 feet, or 213 to 226 centimeters. So a fairly tall lad, albeit quite lanky. And this shows in their weight because they are really only between about 179 to 212 pounds, which means I am actually as heavy as a sand shyuum. And this comes out to 81 to 96 kilograms. They are humanoid in shape and extremely long-lived. The average sand shyuum can live to be about roughly 200 years old based on human years, which means on their home planet, they live a quarter of a millennia, as they can be about 242 years based on the revolution around their sun. However, through their technological prowess and gene manipulation, they could get upwards, with some prophets having lived for over 1,000 years. Now it's time for a side tangent, because let's talk about how this is possible, shall we? And this is just using our basic understanding of genetics in the current tech era, which I think we're actually in tech era 0.73, so we'll get there eventually. But much like the other races within the Halo universe, the sand shyuum are no different and possess DNA like any other creature that is living. As an animal ages, unfortunately for us, the method of replicating cells and subsequently the DNA during mitotic division is nowhere near perfect. Errors happen every single time through things like point mutations, where a piece of DNA is changed. Now, a lot of DNA is known as junk DNA, essentially old genes that have long since been switched off, inserts by viruses which have no impact on us apart from potentially forming the life that we actually lived long ago, or, current symptoms and ailments, and even quite literally the long useless portions that are just there to prevent us from aging, known as telomeres. These are areas of DNA found at the end of chromosomes that are nothing more than repeating patterns of genetic coding. It's actually highly interesting why these exist. If you notice, you don't really look like you're aging until you get to your late 20s or early 30s. That's when you begin to feel it. Trust me, I am the source. But these repeat over and over again, and in human, it sits as TTAGGG. It can be repeated 3,000 times and can even reach up to about 15,000 base pairs in length. Well, every time your cell divides, this DNA gets cut into. It's not fully copied and will get cut shorter and shorter each time. Eventually, this will get to your actual genes that you need. The cell will then lose its ability to properly divide and function, and this leads to aging. Now, there are other reasons that you age, but essentially, it boils down to DNA destruction. If you can save the DNA, the cell in theory would be able to function correctly indefinitely, but this would require genetic manipulation and correcting the damaged DNA. And this is exactly what the sand shyuum did. Correcting the issues in their genes, it appears that they have not perfected the process, as they still do age and are not effectively immortal. In fact, it's been noted that they do suffer things like arthritis, for instance, so their body is in fact aging. And there are other reasons for this. In their original form, hailing from their planet, things like genetic diversity still existed. Because of this existence, those forms of sand shyuum were much healthier. Think of it as like if you have genetic diversity, it's tougher for one thing to take out a species, and one prominent issue can never propagate amongst the population, as different genes exist to combat it. The issue is, as the reformists left, this diversity was lost, and even with inbreeding measures taken, the issues would begin to arise, which is essentially the degradation of their genes. Now, the sand shyuum would try to fix this, but specifically concerning the reformists, their genes began to be overbred and no more diversity could be introduced into the gene pool, and so it began to stagnate. Being that the reformists were in space, their bones also became weaker and their muscles atrophied, which is most prominent in their feet, as they are essentially useless now. This meant that they had to rely on gravity technology to even move. This weakness would also become more and more prominent through the generations, as not only did their bodies react to the low gravity environment, but the lack of new incoming genes meant that traits that would normally happen slowly over time would accelerate, as there were no new incoming genetic diversity to slow or alter these changes. It became a one-track sort of deal. Think of inbreeding as amplifying traits that are already there as they become more and more focused with each subsequent generation. It's sort of like you make a copy of a copy of a copy, and I've mentioned this actually in Halo before. If you notice, like, the teacher's copy looks great, but the copy you receive has been copied 15 times over, it looks like crap. That's essentially inbreeding. So the issue is this accelerates bad traits into being much quicker, which explains the maladaptations the reformist sand shyuum have. So starting with the feet, we see they are curled in. The feet are actually prehensile in nature, likely being owed to the jungle planet that they hail from. Despite appearing amphibious and having come from the ocean and entering the jungles, much like our ancestors, having 4 grasping limbs would have been a fantastic way to survive. Moving up the legs, we see that they are quite atrophied. Long gone are the days of grasping tree branches to move around, and instead, due to the overbred genes and low gravity environments, they have lived for thousands of years, and this has left the little need for powerful limbs. We can surmise from this that the bones within the legs are also quite weak, but not just in the lower limbs, but really all over the body, as we see bone loss in humans who have been in space for only a few months suffer the same issues. Another thing to note is some of them actually used to have blue eyes, like one blue eye, one green eye, and this is known as heterochromia. This actually used to be a desirable trait amongst the sand shyuum, but now due to genetic non-diversity, it is viewed as an actual error within the being itself, so it has become a non-desirable trait. Moving further up the body, we get to the abdominal and chest area. Having a hunched over appearance, it's likely that the sand shyuum's spinal erector muscles are too weak to even hold them upright should they exist in gravity, and this has created a slumping posture overall. Moving down the arms, they are extremely long, and again, Second, likely back on their home planet, they were jumping from tree to tree, meaning that longer limbs would be much more useful, much like the apes of Earth. Getting to the hands, this is going to be important. We see that 2 fingers exist, with one of them being the thumb. So the shyuum we see concerning the Reformists have 3 digits overall. Moving up to the head, we see in the older Reformists, they have longer necks, much longer than humans, but still have the same basic facial structures as humans. Because our home planet species did eventually decide to stand upright to move, this meant that when they are younger, their neck supports the head from underneath, allowing for the brain to be larger in size. However, with the Reformists, their head now leans more forward, with the neck still attached to the base of the skull. But long-term implications would suggest that eventually it would move to the back of the skull through further likely inbreeding and worn-out genes. This would begin to limit the intelligence of the Reformists, as their necks could not hold up that weight. We see this with Earth-based organisms. In quadrupeds, the skulls are attached at the back to the spine. In bipedals, us, it attaches at the base, allowing for bone to hold up the skull instead of muscle. The face of the Reformists also seems to change as they get older, with the eyes widening outwards with age and the chin also becoming wider. Bits of flesh dangle on either side, and some also seem to have a wattle of sorts hanging from underneath their chins. There is a little bit of hair on their heads, but most are in fact completely hairless. The nose is nothing more than 2 openings inside of the maxilla area of the skull, and the back of the skull protrudes fairly far out, showing the creature has an extremely large brain. Overall, the Reformist, from what we can tell, is just a shell of its former species. The weakness seen in its body is from likely some inbreeding taking place and the same genes being propagated over and over again, with genetic diversity likely added much too late in the game and the constant low gravity also causing problems. Because the original shyuum is where we see a strong species actually built by its planet to be a contender out in the universe. Before getting to the Stoics, there is something that should be noted. It is entirely possible that genetically the shyuum were screwed with. Considering humans were much more muscular, taller, and more intelligent than modern humans, this meant that they were genetically tampered with by the Forerunners as a punishment. In fact, the librarian mentions how, given enough time, the gene map for humanity would have surpassed even the Forerunners. So the Forerunners were no strangers to gene manipulation. It's entirely possible that the ancient shyuum suffered the same fate. And here's my reasoning. The creature that we see in Halo Infinite, comparing her to the shyuum, is pretty clear to tell that she has the same lithe appearance as to what's been described with the shyuum on their home planet. Her legs are the same, her feet curl inwards much like the prophets. She is incredibly skinny in the abdominal area with a larger chest and arms that are also very long. One of the things mentioned by my boy Hidden Xperia, however, is that she has 4 fingers instead of 3. To me, this is a clear indication that this is the original form of shyuum. She is likely an older, as in completely ancient form of shyuum. Perhaps she was in stasis and forgotten about until recently awoken after power may have been cut after Cortana straight up knocked out all electricity in the galaxy. A safety feature in the pod that she may have been in would wake her up as the power was lost, thus releasing her over 100,000 years in the future. This is speculation, but the signs really kind of all appear to point to this. This means that genetically the shyuum were punished as well, potentially not as heavily as humanity, but enough to set them back when they were reseeded onto their planet. Because we see with all accounts of Stoics, they are built morphologically the same as Reformists, as they hail from these same genetically tampered with species, but they are still stronger because they were on their home planet. Not anymore though. They're able to move within environments under their own power in an upright manner, and they still possess 3 fingers. These Stoics appear to have likely been destroyed by the star-going supernova, but what's interesting is, with the release of this female shyuum, this could imply that there are others out there who just haven't been seen yet. Remembering how humanity basically got them into a heap of trouble means that she might not be too interested in helping humanity with anything, which accounts for the aggression that we have seen. Although she might be interested to know why humanity looks vastly different from what it used to look like. Maybe she thinks she's now just fighting children, I don't know. But ultimately, the fate of the shyuum and the individuals that chose to follow them is what happens when you follow a group of religious fanatics who are likely inbred to a degree and way too old to be leading anyone. As their bodies failed through the generations and through time, it's pretty clear likely their minds were beginning to fail, leading to more and more aggressive approaches when dealing with species outside of the Covenant, basically humanity. Then, as they began to feed more and more of their own into the meat grinder, this would ultimately spell their undoing. Not much is known about how many are left or where they may be located, but if several thousand are believed to be left alive, and with possibly ancient shyuum being added into the mix, their species may see a resurgence in the future, but likely extinction awaits them should they be found by the Sangheili.